when some Americans imagine the transformation of this country, they imagine that they're going to lose if we actually create an equitable and just and anti-racist America. And it seems, as you've written, is that that's based on a zero-sum logic. What is that logic?
So I left a career in economic policy to go out on this quixotic journey in some ways to find the answer to the question of why can't we seem to have nice things and what are the roots of our dysfunction. And it's there that I really came upon this paradigm of the zero sum. And it's a term that means basically when you have people who are in a competition with one another or in a game with one another, if team A scores one more point, team B scores one less point, and that there's no such thing as sort of mutual progress, that progress for team A has to come at the expense of team B, that the points will always add up to zero, positive on one side, negative on the other. There's a limited or fixed pie. And that idea resonated so deeply with me. It sort of gave a name and a description to something I'd sensed my whole life, was that there was this fear that when white supremacy falls, that the world that will become is one that white people should fear. And so therefore that racism is like really great for white people, really terrible for people of color. And so their self-interest is in preserving racism at all costs. And it's the at all costs piece that really felt so important for me to lay out. What are the costs of racism to our entire society? What exactly is the price that white people are willing to pay to keep the system as it has been? And once I started looking, like the list just kept growing. And that made it clear to me that we weren't telling the full story, right? That just as on the zero sum side, we have these, and this is an important piece of the story, we have self-interested elites packaging, marketing, selling this zero-sum lie to most white Americans. And they're doing it for their own profit. But our side, when we only talk about racism as something that's good for white people, are kind of like helping out a little bit, right? Like, we're my provocation, right? The agitation that made me feel like, okay, maybe I do have something to add to this conversation was we haven't told the full story of what it has cost this entire country. And that's kind of where the book begins.
I'm asking this because this is what I've been sort of saying, and I want to know whether I'm just wrong. That white that white Americans typically compare their lot to people of color, and so in other words, if their school has more resources, and in a way their child's school is almost like a first class school, they're like, whoa, if we create equity, then I'm going to be back in coach. I don't want that. I'm going to lose. My kid's going to lose. And so they're constantly assessing themselves, judging themselves, comparing themselves to people of color. But it seems to me that they instead should be assessing themselves, meaning white Americans should be assessing themselves from other white people in the Western world. And when they make that comparison, that's when they can see actually what they don't have, how they're in coach.
That's right. And in fact, maybe in other societies in the Western world, everybody's just in first class, right? There's no little curtain that the flight attendant moves over, right? Everyone gets food, right? Everyone has a leg room, everybody gets to bring a bag, you know what I'm saying? This really comes from and is a feature of how brutally hierarchical our society is. And In the first chapter of The Sum of Us, called the Zero-Sum Racial Hierarchy, I go back to in our history. I unlike somebody else here on this conversation, I'm not an historian, but I felt like I had to go to the beginning to find out where this zero-sum worldview and this lie came from, whose interest it served, and why it sort of reanimated generation after generation. And as it turns out, it was created as a way to sort of discipline soon-to-be white Europeans in the colonial era to be sort of satisfied with their lot in a society where wealth was still quite concentrated, and where, because of chattel slavery and the plantation economy, there actually wasn't a lot of room, right? A white person who was not a plantation owner in this economy, like, their labor wasn't needed in the Southern economy, right? Like, what do we need you for, right? There was just actually not a lot of room to move, and not a lot of relative freedom. And yet the creation of the myth of white supremacy, and I think it's really important that we always talk about the myth of white supremacy, because we don't want to reify the idea that white people are actually supreme. But this myth of white supremacy was sold to white masses so that they could have, of course, as W.B. Du Bois said, the psychological wages of whiteness rather than material wages, that they need not contest too strongly for material wages because they had the psychological wages. And those psychological wages were knowing always that they, in a deeply unequal economy, could nonetheless count on being more than and better than Black people.